All right. I won't take up too much of your time because I know already it was the longest 10 minutes that you've ever experienced. Once again, I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight. And the book table's up here. This is indeed a very strange book. It is a book about parasites. And I thought that at events like this, you should usually start off with some kind of an anecdote or a joke as a kind of icebreaker. And so I was trying to find a good joke about parasites, but I didn't want to share them. Some of the best ones had to do with Trump. But I won't expose you to them right now. Suffice it to say, I did think I would start with an anecdote, a personal anecdote. And so don't worry, it's not that personal, it's not about me. And it's not one of those anecdotes about a friend of a friend that's really about me. It's actually just an anecdote. So when I was a little kid, I can remember hearing this story from my grandmother, my Oma. And she told me about these friends of the family. And so apparently one day, and you know, just because I never know whose descendants are in the room, I'm not going to tell you their name. But so one day, the male individual in the couple was standing at the bus stop. And I should say that he was German, it was a German couple, and they enjoyed eating what's called pork met, which is raw pork tartare. And so back in the day, they didn't have the same health food regulations, so you were often just eating raw pork. That's important for the story that follows. So he was standing at the bus stop, and then he felt something going on down there. And it turned out that he had a colony of tapeworms in his colon. And now tapeworms are fairly antisocial creatures. They don't like being crowded. And so one little tapeworm, the little tapeworm that could, crawled out of his anus, right there at the bus stop, wriggled down his pants, and started to go down the street. And it was headed to Bay Street because it was trying to find a job. Or maybe Wall Street, but that's a longer commute, isn't it? But so I remember hearing this story and I was terrified. I was filled with fear. I didn't want to eat anything again because I said to Oma, how on earth could this happen? And she said, well, he was eating pork tartare. And I said, but Oma, we eat beef tartare. And she said, oh, don't worry. And the reason she said that was because she flash froze the tartare. But it turns out that now that I've done research for this book, most home freezers don't go down to the adequate temperature that is required to kill tapeworm eggs. Nonetheless, I think I'm fine. Who said that? But the point is, it's interesting. So tapeworms are coming more into consciousness again, particularly in BC. So usually tapeworm stats, tapeworm infections tend to be between 6 to 10 every year in BC. These are the BC stats. And this year, for the first time in a decade, they've had 64 cases of tapeworm infection. Now, why? That's the question. Why? The problem is hipsters. I'm serious. The problem is hipsters. I've said this about many issues. But in this case, the problem is hipsters. And it's because they want to prepare raw sushi at home, and they don't know that there are little critters that live inside your food. And so they aren't preparing it properly. So this is a little warning to anyone who may want to prepare their own home sushi. Make sure you use a sushi grade freezer. And that's the anecdote. So indeed, this book is about parasites, but it's particularly about language parasites. Now, the notion that language is a parasitic process is not a new idea. You can find it in a lot of different places. William Burroughs famously claimed that the word is now a virus. And you can also find it in Giorgio Agamben's book, What is an Apparatus?, where he talks about how at a certain point in history, and of course he's unclear on when, because continental theorists are often unclear on when these things happen, but he said at a certain point in history, an ape was captivated by language. The first ape was captivated by language. And a kind of captivation would be a kind of infection, would it not? And then of course there's Lacan, Jacques Lacan's theory of psychoanalysis, where he says that we are all born into language. And indeed, the first word that infects us is essentially our name, and we get it from our parents. It's a name that we don't decide on, it comes from the outside, and then it structures our entire life to a certain extent. And then the language that we're exposed to in our communities, in our familial communities, or in our friend groups, also influences and also infects us. Now, since that idea is a fairly old one, I thought, why not ask, what would be the corresponding theory of being for that language? If we're all, assuming we can trust post-structuralism, if we're all speaking subjects, then the language that we use would necessarily influence the being that we have. And so the study of being is ontology. And so I thought, what is needed here is to coin a new concept, a new term. So I came up with Phorontology. So ontology is the study of being, and Phorontology is the study of parasitic being, or it's the study of being as a parasitism. Now, a phoront is a tiny little parasitic creature that uses other animals for travel. It engages in what's called parasitic migration. And so good examples of this would be ticks, fleas, lice. These are all phoronts. And I became rather fascinated by phoronts because I don't think that there's any kind of being that lives in itself. We always live beside. And a parasite is, of course, something that eats beside. It eats and it lives beside. And so if we're going to configure or understand what subjectivity can be in the 21st century, I think we have to begin to understand it not as something in itself, something that is necessarily beside and in between, something purely liminal. And for that reason, I developed this concept which exists in between subjects and objects. And of course, many people in this room are academics, so you all know that the concept of the subject and the concept of the object are in a sense hallmarks of philosophy. They're very old. But neither is, in a sense, as far as I argue it in this book, appropriate for our contemporary world. Instead, what we need a liminal subjectivity, a purely liminal subjectivity, a subject that is fully in between. And for that reason, I think that we need a transject. And I think that to a certain extent, for a realist category of being, it's always been a transject. We are all transjects. We are all transjected. We are all in the process of transjection. We're not subjects anymore. And so, without further ado, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I will read from the end of this book, which is a manifesto, and it's called the Transject Manifesto. It's like the light is, there we go. We are the new workers of phenomenology. Our being is our labor. We no longer be in any manner that delimits the self to a binary, a boundary, a dyad, or a decision. We work in the tradition of Husserl, Heidegger, and Merleau-Ponty, but do not remain contained in a hegemonic paradigm of masculine, heteronormative, white, or able-bodied perspectives. This older subject is the dead corpse of the author on the gurney of textuality. Eject is thrown. The thrownness of jection appears as either an interjection or an introjection. This process situates projects, dejects, and rejects within various cages, jail cells, government buildings, and draconian facades of Kantian schemata. Every schemata is a building, and every building is built upon a site that requires excavation. The age-old subject and object binary is unnecessary, duplicitous, discursive, a delimiting jail cell of constraint. We must break the Lacanian bars of our schematized prisons. The transject, there we go. The transject, like the subject, the object, the deject, and the project, is a field-specific and local name of an ontological entity. The subject has been the appropriate name for the ontological entity, also known as a human being, because of specific historical and ideological dictates. We are, traditionally speaking, subjects. Subjects of a king, subjects of a state, subjects of an institutionalized power structure. We have been subjected endlessly. The revolution must, at its core, resist any ontologization of the self as subject. We are now subjects of, or subject ofs, which are the small micro-identities that inhabit a transject. Every of is a parasite that feeds upon your identity and, conversely, renders that identity as only ever imaginarily coherent. The transject has become a terminological necessity in our contemporary era. The transject describes what is really happening on the street outside of the ivory tower. However, even inside the ivory tower, contemporary philosophy has reflected the emergence of this new category in its concern with liminal categories. Philosophies now ask, and have been asking for several decades, how can we think the in-between? The transject is the name of an ontological category that is represented by realist instances of parasites and expands to include many other liminal states of being. Is the liminal doubly parasitic then? Parasitic to both sides? Does one side, and what are these sides or borders, get jealous of the other? A bifurcated, disloyal, and polygamous parasite is worse than one who steals the entire life force of the border entities. To share one's parasite is the great melancholic crisis of the border state. The lighting. It is the true reason why liminality is disparaged, feared, policed, sought out, and fundamentally destroyed. The secret ontological name of all that exists is xenoject. The xenoject is the generic category of every possible ontological state that may exist in our own solar system, galaxy, universe, and every other possible dimensional variant. It's fine. It's fine. If your self exists as another self in another universe or another polydimensional brain, then that self is xenojected as a component of yourself that exists elsewhere. Every subject is only a small, localized category of an overall, unthinkable xenoject. The human sciences and humanities have developed to the point where we can finally begin to consider the xenoject. The xenoject encompasses imagined selves, various identities, and even dream states of self. The xenoject even encompasses a vitalist understanding of ontology where every rock or twig or branch or creature or temporarily unified entity contains an energetic piece of self. The xenoject encompasses any of the souls you may have had or may have, including every metempsychotic iteration of your own self and every other alien self. Perhaps part of your xenoject lives in another brain, in another galaxy, as an amoeba in an alien ocean. we can now begin to think about the phenomenologically anterior. The xenoject and the transject are expressions of a post-mortem era in which textuality has become something much weirder, non-linear, and aperiodic than ever before. Now texts are as material as the bodies they inscribe, and the bodies they inscribe are as incorporeal as communion wafers. We have entered the post-mortem of the postmodern. All our corpses wait on the gurney of our transjections. Thank you very much.